I was sitting in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, opening what I thought was another care package from home, when I found the real estate documents. Not a letter explaining why. Not a phone call preparing me. Just a manila envelope with my name scrawled across it in my mother's handwriting, tucked between homemade cookies and beef jerky. Sold was stamped in red ink across the front page. The house I'd bought at 22, the one I'd spent 3 years renovating with my own hands, the one I'd left in their care while I served my country, gone. Transferred to them for $1, my signature is forged at the bottom. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My squad leader found me 20 minutes later, still staring at the papers, cookies scattered across the dusty ground. "Martinez, you good?" she asked. I couldn't answer. How do you explain that the people who raised you to believe in honor and duty just sold your future while you were dodging IEDs 8,000 miles away? The date on the sale was 2 months old. 2 months they'd been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, using my furniture, while telling me over satellite phone calls how proud they were of my service. 2 months of lies wrapped in, "We love you," and "Stay safe, son." I'd bought that house the day I got back from my first deployment. It wasn't much, a small 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood outside Fort Carson. But it was mine, the first thing that had ever truly belonged to me. I'd saved every penny of combat pay for the down payment, worked weekends doing construction to afford the monthly payments, spent my leave time installing new floors and painting walls. My parents had seemed proud when I showed them the keys. My father, David Martinez, a retired factory worker who'd spent 40 years complaining about never owning anything substantial, had walked through each room nodding approvingly. My mother, Carmen, had fussed over the kitchen, suggesting where I should put appliances, what colors would work best. They seemed genuinely happy for me. When my second deployment orders came through, the decision felt natural. "Can you keep an eye on the house?" I'd asked them. They were renting a cramped apartment across town, always behind on bills, always stressed about money. "Maybe even stay there while I'm gone, keep it lived in, make sure nothing happens to it." Their faces had lit up like I'd just handed them a winning lottery ticket. Of course they'd watch it, of course they'd take care of everything. I was their son. They'd raised me right. They understood sacrifice. I'd left them a power of attorney for emergencies only, to handle utilities, maintenance issues, anything that might come up while I was deployed. The paperwork was specific, emergency use only, with the understanding that I'd handle everything else remotely or when I returned. I'd even set up automatic bill payments, left detailed instructions for the lawn service, made it as simple as possible. The first few months of deployment, everything seemed perfect. They'd send pictures of the house, the lawn neatly trimmed, the flower beds I'd planted looking healthy. My mother would call weekly with updates, how the neighbors were so kind, how much they enjoyed having space to breathe, how grateful they were for the opportunity to help their son. My father, usually a man of few words, had even gotten on the phone once to tell me how proud he was. "You've done good, Sophia," he'd said, using the childhood nickname he dropped when I enlisted. "This house, your service, you've built something real." I'd felt warm hearing that, 8,000 miles from home, sleeping on a cot in a tent that smelled like diesel fuel and dust. My parents were finally comfortable. I was serving my country. Everything was falling into place exactly like I'd planned. But now, holding these documents in my hands, I realized I'd been living in a fantasy. While I was conducting night raids and convoy security, dodging mortars and roadside bombs, they'd been scheming. While I was sending half my combat pay home to help with their expenses, they were researching how to steal my house. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the calculation behind it. This wasn't a desperate moment of weakness or a sudden financial crisis. The documents showed months of preparation, meetings with real estate attorneys, trips to the courthouse, careful forgeries of my signature. They'd planned this while I was risking my life for strangers' freedom. They'd even been smart about it. The sale was structured to avoid tax implications for them, transferring ownership for a nominal fee between family members. They'd probably researched it thoroughly, maybe even consulted with professionals about how to make it legal, how to make it stick. What they hadn't researched was me. They'd sent their son off to war, but they'd forgotten that war changes people. The scared 19-year-old who'd enlisted to escape their constant financial drama and their toxic cycles of blame wasn't the same person reading these documents. I'd learned things in the military about planning, about patience, about how to dismantle an enemy systematically and completely. I'd also learned about resources they couldn't imagine: military legal assistance, congressional inquiry processes, federal oversight of power of attorney abuse, chain of command protocols that could make civilian problems disappear faster than a drone strike. They thought they were dealing with their little boy, the one who'd always backed down from confrontation, who'd given them money whenever they asked, who'd believed their promises because he wanted to believe his parents were good people. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a United States soldier who'd spent 2 years learning exactly how to fight. That night, I didn't call them. I didn't send an angry email or fire off a desperate text demanding explanations. Instead, I walked to the communications tent and began making very different kinds of calls. To the base legal office, to my unit's family readiness group, to a military law clinic that specialized in deployment-related fraud cases. I also did something they'd never taught me at home, but the Army had drilled into me. I began documenting everything, every document they'd sent, every conversation we'd had, every photo they'd shared of my house, every lie they'd told was wrapped in expressions of love and support. Because while they'd been planning their theft, I'd been learning something they'd never understand: the difference between family and loyalty, between blood relations and honor, between the people who say they love you and the people who actually have your back when everything falls apart. They'd raised a daughter, but they'd just made an enemy of a soldier. Growing up in the Martinez household meant learning that love came with conditions, and those conditions always involved money. My earliest memory isn't of birthday parties or family vacations. It's of sitting at the kitchen table at age 7, listening to my parents argue about which bill to pay first while I pretended to do homework. My father worked at the Westinghouse plant, pulling double shifts when he could get them, coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, taking the bus 2 hours each way because we couldn't afford a reliable car. They worked hard, but somehow money slipped through their fingers like water through a broken dam. It wasn't their fault, they'd tell me. It was the economy. It was their bosses. It was bad luck. It was everything except the credit cards they maxed out, buying things we didn't need. Or the trips to the casino when they got their tax refund. Or the way they'd argue about money for hours, but never actually sit down and make a budget. By the time I was 12, I understood the family hierarchy. My parents' needs came first: their cigarettes, their lottery tickets, their weekend beers. Then came the bills, paid in order of which company called the most. Then came groceries, usually whatever was cheapest or on sale. I came last, if there was anything left. School clothes came from Goodwill, which was fine, but they'd make me lie about it to relatives. Miguel's growing so fast, we can barely keep up with buying him new things, my mother would say at family gatherings, while I wore a polo shirt with someone else's name faded on the collar. When I turned 16 and got my first job bagging groceries at Kroger, they celebrated like I'd won a scholarship, but the celebration came with expectations. Family contributes, my father said, the same night he asked for $40 to cover part of the electric bill. We've taken care of you for 16 years. Now you help take care of us. That $40 became $60 the next month, then $100. By senior year, I was working 25 hours a week after school and handing over most of my paycheck to keep our lights on. My guidance counselor asked why I wasn't applying to colleges. How do you explain that your parents have convinced you that family loyalty means financial sacrifice? The military recruiter found me at the grocery store on a Tuesday night in March. Staff Sergeant Williams, a calm woman with kind eyes who didn't pitch me on glory or adventure. She talked about job training, about the GI Bill, about steady pay and health care. But what sold me was something she said almost as an afterthought. You'll have your own money, daughter. Your own choices. My parents' reaction was immediate and dramatic. My mother cried like I'd been diagnosed with cancer. My father accused me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. They'd sacrificed everything for me, they said. The least I could do was stick around and help them get back on their feet. But I'd already learned something they didn't realize they'd taught me. Their feet were never going to be stable. There would always be another crisis, another bill, another emergency that required my money, my time, my future. I enlisted 2 days after graduation. Basic training was brutal, but it was also the first time in my life that I wasn't responsible for anyone else's financial mistakes. For the first time, I had money in my account that stayed there. I could buy new clothes, real ones, that fit properly and didn't carry other people's histories in their fabric. My first duty station was Fort Benning, Georgia. I rented a small apartment off base, furnished it with actual furniture instead of hand-me-downs and garage sale finds. I bought a reliable car, a 3-year-old Honda Civic that started every morning and didn't require prayers or special tricks. I was 20 years old and finally living like a functional adult. My parents visited once during those first 2 years. They spent the entire weekend commenting on how much everything must have cost, asking detailed questions about my salary, suggesting that maybe I was being irresponsible with money by having such a nice apartment when they were still struggling back home. Before they left, my mother sat me down for what she called a heart-to-heart. The apartment complex was raising their rent again. My father's hours had been cut. They were behind on the car payment, and if they lost the car, they'd both lose their jobs. Could I help? Just this once? They'd pay me back as soon as things turned around. I sent them $800, then another $600 the next month when the water heater broke, then $400 when my father's car needed new brakes. Each time came with promises of repayment, with gratitude, with assurances that this was temporary, that they just needed to get over this one hurdle. But there was always another hurdle. And slowly, I began to realize that their financial crises weren't random bad luck. They were patterns, the same mistakes repeated monthly, the same priorities, with their immediate wants always outweighing practical needs. The same requests for help, always framed as emergencies, but arriving with predictable regularity. My first deployment to Iraq changed something fundamental in how I saw the world. Living in a combat zone teaches you to distinguish between actual emergencies and manufactured drama. When you've seen real poverty, real desperation, the kind where people lose everything through no fault of their own, it becomes harder to sympathize with self-inflicted financial wounds. I came back from that deployment with $28,000 in combat pay savings and a clarity about what I wanted: stability. A place that was mine that couldn't be taken away by someone else's poor choices. I wanted to break the cycle I'd grown up in, to build something solid and permanent. Finding the house felt like fate. It was small but well built, in a neighborhood where people mowed their lawns and fixed their fences. The previous owner, an elderly veteran, had maintained it carefully. It needed cosmetic work, paint, new flooring, updated fixtures, but the bones were good. I spent every weekend for 6 months renovating that house, stripping wallpaper, sanding floors, learning to tile from YouTube videos. My hands got cut and calloused, my back ached, but every improvement felt like a victory. This was mine. I was building something that would last. My parents' visits during the renovation were enlightening. They'd walk through the rooms making suggestions, expensive suggestions. Maybe I should knock out this wall, upgrade to granite counters, add a deck. When I explained my budget limitations, they'd look disappointed, like I was being cheap with something that should reflect the family status. The real revelation came when I finished the kitchen. I'd installed new cabinets myself, working nights and weekends for 2 months to get them perfect. My mother's first comment wasn't congratulations or pride. It was, if you'd gone with the oak instead of the maple, it would have added more to the resale value. That's when I understood something crucial. They didn't see my house as my achievement. They saw it as a family asset, something that belonged to all of us by virtue of blood relation. My success was their success, which meant my property was their security. When my deployment orders came through, I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing by letting them stay there. They needed help, I had the space. And I'd be gone anyway. It felt like a perfect solution. They'd have a comfortable place to live, and my house would be occupied and maintained. I should have recognized the warning signs. The way my father's eyes lingered on the deed when I showed him the paperwork. The detailed questions my mother asked about property taxes and homeowners insurance. The casual comments about how much easier their lives would be if they had a place like this permanently. But I was still thinking like their son, not like a soldier. I was still operating under the assumption that family meant loyalty, that blood relations created unbreakable bonds of trust and mutual support. I had no idea I was about to learn the hardest lesson of my life. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most willing to destroy you for their own benefit. The first red flag came disguised as good news. 3 months into my deployment, my mother called during one of our scheduled video chats, her face glowing with excitement on the pixelated screen. "Sophia, you'll never guess what happened," she said, practically bouncing in what I recognized as my kitchen chair. "The Hendersons next door invited us to their anniversary party. They said we were such wonderful neighbors." Something about her tone felt off. She was talking like she belonged there, like this was her neighborhood, her social circle. "That's nice, Mom," I said carefully. "Did you mention I'll be back in 8 months?" Her smile flickered for just a second. "Of course, mija. But you know how it is. Neighbors like consistency. It's good for property values when the same people are always around." Property values. That phrase stuck with me for days. Why was my mother, who'd never owned property in her life, suddenly concerned about real estate economics? The second flag came 2 weeks later. My father had never been comfortable with technology, but suddenly he was asking detailed questions about my online banking, my automatic bill payments, whether I was monitoring my credit score. "Just want to make sure everything's running smooth while you're gone," he said. "You know how these computer things can get mixed up." I started paying closer attention to our conversations. My mother would slip in comments about the mailman, how she'd had to sign for packages addressed to the house. My father mentioned talking to the lawn service about adjusting the schedule without consulting me first. They were making decisions about my property like they owned it. The third flag was the photographs. They'd been sending pictures since the beginning, proof that they were taking good care of things. But I started noticing changes. New curtains in the living room. A different coffee table. My weight bench moved from the garage to the basement. When I asked about it, my mother said they were just organizing things better and making the space more livable. My weight bench had been in the garage because that's where I wanted my home gym. The coffee table they'd replaced was one I'd picked out myself, solid oak that had cost me 3 paychecks. The curtains were covering windows I'd specifically left bare because I liked the natural light. They weren't maintaining my house, they were redecorating it. That's when I started keeping records. Not because I suspected theft, that possibility hadn't even occurred to me yet. I was just trying to understand why I felt so uneasy about conversations with my own parents. I opened a small notebook and began jotting down details after each call. October 15th. Mom mentioned rearranging the living room for better flow. Asked about my TV, wants to mount it differently. October 22nd. Dad talked to HVAC repair guy about upgrading the system. Didn't ask permission, just mentioned it casually. November 3rd. Mom said neighbor Mrs. Patterson brought over a casserole for us. Started talking about holiday decorations like she's planning to host Thanksgiving. The pattern became clear once I started writing it down. They weren't house-sitting, they were nesting. But the real awakening came through a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I was in the communications tent, waiting for my scheduled call time, when the line connected early. My parents were mid-conversation, not realizing I could hear them. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Talked to Martinez about the refinancing option, my father was saying. She thinks we could pull maybe $60,000 in equity. But Sophia would have to sign the papers, my mother replied, and she's not stupid. She'd ask questions. Not if we handle it right. We've got power of attorney for emergencies. House needs a new roof, new foundation work, whatever we tell her. She's 8,000 miles away. What's she gonna do, fly home to check? My blood turned to ice. Martinez was their cousin Tony, who worked at a shady real estate office downtown. And they were talking about refinancing my house, taking out loans against my property while I was deployed. I hung up without announcing myself and sat in stunned silence for 20 minutes. Then I called back at the scheduled time and acted like nothing had happened. My mother chattered about the weather, my father asked about my unit, and both of them lied to my face with the ease of career criminals. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word. They had power of attorney for emergencies, yes, but refinancing wasn't an emergency. It was theft. They were planning to steal my equity, saddle me with debt, and probably lie about what the money was for. But what shook me most was the casual way they'd discussed it. This wasn't a desperate plan hatched in a moment of financial crisis. This was calculated, premeditated fraud, discussed over coffee in my kitchen like they were planning a weekend trip. I started researching. Military bases have legal assistance offices, and I made an appointment the next day. Captain Sarah Chen, the JAG officer, listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard similar tales before. Deployment fraud is more common than people think, she told me. Family members see an opportunity and convince themselves they're entitled to it. The good news is you're documenting everything. The bad news is power of attorney abuse can be difficult to prove unless you catch them in the act. She helped me set up monitoring systems I'd never known existed. Credit monitoring that would alert me to any new accounts or credit inquiries. Bank alerts for any changes to my automatic payments. Property record searches that would flag any new liens or legal actions against my house. The key, Captain Chen explained, is building an evidence file. If they're planning what you think they're planning, they'll leave a paper trail. And when they do, you'll have everything you need to stop them. I also learned about my rights as a deployed service member. The Service Members Civil Relief Act, which protects military personnel from legal action while deployed. The military family life counselors who could help document emotional abuse. The Inspector General system for reporting fraud involving military families. Most importantly, I learned about resources I could access that my parents had no idea existed. Congressional inquiry systems that could freeze financial transactions. Military legal advocacy that operated faster than civilian courts. Federal agencies that took deployment-related fraud very seriously. Over the next month, I built a comprehensive monitoring system. I set up automated alerts for every aspect of my financial life. I documented every conversation with my parents, noting discrepancies and lies. I researched the legal requirements for power of attorney use in Colorado, printing copies of relevant statutes. I also did something that felt strange but necessary. I began investigating my own parents. I pulled their credit reports, legally accessible since they were living at my address. I researched their employment history, their previous addresses, their financial patterns. What I found was disturbing. They'd declared bankruptcy twice in the past 15 years. They'd been evicted from 3 different apartments for non-payment of rent. They'd defaulted on multiple car loans, had wages garnished for unpaid debts, and owed back taxes to the IRS. My parents weren't just bad with money. They were financial disasters with a long history of leaving wreckage behind them. Most troubling was a pattern I hadn't noticed before. They'd always had someone else to bail them out. An uncle who'd co-signed loans, grandparents who'd paid rent, relatives who'd loaned money that was never repaid. I'd just been the latest in a long line of financial enablers, and now they were looking to graduate from borrowing my money to stealing my property. The final piece of my awakening came through a conversation with my squad leader, Sergeant First Class Martinez. He'd noticed my distraction during missions, the way I'd check my phone obsessively whenever we had signal. When I finally told him what was happening, his response was immediate and practical. "Rodriguez, you're thinking like a victim instead of like a soldier," he said. "Stop reacting to what they might do, and start planning what you're going to do. You've got training, resources, and legal protections they can't imagine. Use them." She was right. I'd been so focused on trying to prevent my parents from betraying me that I'd forgotten the most important lesson the Army had taught me. When someone declares themselves your enemy, you don't negotiate with them. You neutralize the threat. That night, I opened a new section in my notebook. Instead of just recording their actions, I began planning my own, not revenge, strategy. step-by-step procedures for protecting my assets, documenting their crimes, and ensuring they faced consequences for what they were planning. Because I'd finally understood something crucial. This wasn't about family drama or misunderstandings. This was about people who were willing to destroy my future for their immediate benefit. And the U.S. Army had spent 2 years teaching me exactly how to deal with that kind of enemy. The attack that almost killed me happened on a Tuesday morning in January. Our convoy was returning from a routine supply run when the IED detonated 50 meters ahead of our lead vehicle. The blast threw our Humvee sideways into a concrete barrier, and for 30 seconds, the world went silent except for the ringing in my ears. Specialist Johnson was unconscious, blood running from his nose. Corporal Davies was screaming about his leg. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel something warm running down my forehead, but my hands were already moving, checking weapons, scanning for secondary threats, calling in the medevac request. We spent 6 hours in a forward aid station while medics patched us up and helicopters evacuated the worst casualties. Minor concussion, they told me. 12 stitches above my left eyebrow. Returned to duty in 48 hours. I was lucky. Johnson would be flying home with a traumatic brain injury, and Davies lost 3 toes. That night, lying on my cot with my head pounding and gauze taped across my face, I realized something profound. I'd almost died 8,000 miles from home, and my biggest worry wasn't whether I'd see my family again. It was whether they'd find a way to steal my house while I was in the hospital. The morphine made everything crystal clear in a way that sobriety never had. These people who claimed to love me had become a bigger threat to my future than the insurgents trying to kill me. At least the enemy here was honest about their intentions. I called home the next day during my medical downtime. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Miguel, how are you, baby? We were just talking about you." "I was in an explosion yesterday," I said without preamble. "IED blast. Thought you should know." The silence stretched so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then, quietly, "Are you hurt?" "Concussion. Stitches. I'm fine." I waited for the rush of concern, the maternal panic, the demand for details. Instead, I got something that made my blood run cold. "Well, thank God it wasn't serious," she said, and I could hear relief in her voice, but not the kind a mother feels when her daughter survives combat. This was the relief of someone whose plans hadn't been disrupted. "You had us worried for a second there." "Worried about what? That their theft victim might die before they could complete the paperwork?" "Sophia, since I have you on the phone," she continued, her tone shifting to businesslike efficiency, "your father needs to talk to you about some house maintenance issues. There's been some water damage in the basement, and we need authorization to get it fixed before it gets worse." Water damage. In the basement, I'd waterproofed myself 2 years ago. In the house, I'd inspected top to bottom before leaving. Water damage that somehow required my father's involvement instead of a simple call to my insurance company. "Put him on," I said. My father's voice carried the forced gravity of a man delivering bad news. "Daughter, I hate to bother you with this while you're deployed, but we've got a real problem here. Looks like the foundation has some serious issues. Water's been seeping in, and there's structural damage we didn't notice before." He was lying. I knew he was lying. But more than that, I knew exactly what kind of lie this was. Foundation work was expensive, complicated, and would require major renovation, the perfect excuse for refinancing or taking out a home equity loan. "How much?" I asked. "Well, we got an estimate from Martinez Construction." Of course they did. "And they're saying maybe 40-50,000 to do it right. But the good news is, with the equity you've built up, we can handle the financing through the house. All we need is your signature on some paperwork." There it was. The trap they'd been building for months finally sprung. Fake emergency, inflated repair costs, family construction company, and a loan against my property that would conveniently disappear into their pockets. "I need to see pictures," I said, "detailed photos of all the damage before any work gets started." Quote. Another pause. "Miguel, we're trying to handle this quickly before it gets worse. The contractor says if we wait much longer, we could be looking at complete foundation replacement." "Then you'll wait. I want documentation of every inch of damage before anyone signs anything or starts any work. Email me photos tonight." I hung up before he could argue. The photos never came. Instead, I got a text from my mother the next morning. Dad's back went out carrying sandbags for the basement flooding. Can't get to the camera right now. Contractor needs an answer by Friday or we lose the slot. Sandbags for basement flooding in January in Colorado during a drought year. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. I called Captain Chen and told her I was ready to activate every legal protection available to me as a deployed service member. I need an emergency injunction against any financial transactions involving my property, I said, and I need it filed before Friday. Do you have evidence of fraudulent activity? I have recorded conversations, documented lies, and a pattern of deception spanning 4 months. They're claiming emergency repairs that don't exist to justify taking out loans against my house. Captain Chen was quiet for a moment. Miguel, once we file this, there's no going back. Your parents will know you're on to them. And family relationships, they don't usually survive this kind of legal action. Captain, with respect, this stopped being about family the moment they decided to commit fraud against a deployed soldier. The paperwork moved faster than I'd expected. By Thursday, injunctions were in place freezing any new financial activity on my property. By Friday, my parents received certified letters informing them that any attempt to modify, refinance, or encumber my house would result in federal charges. They called 17 times that day. I didn't answer. Instead, I spent Friday afternoon in the base legal office with Captain Chen and a civilian attorney she'd recommended, a specialist in military family fraud cases. We built a comprehensive protection plan, credit freezes, property alerts, and a restricted power of attorney that revoked their authority to make any financial decisions on my behalf. Your parents made a critical error, the civilian attorney explained. They assumed you were isolated and uninformed. They didn't realize that deployed service members have access to legal resources that can move faster than any civilian court system. But the real turning point came Saturday morning, when I received an email from my father. Not a phone call, not a text, a formal email with a subject line that read, "Legal consultation required." The message was short and to the point. "Sophia, we've consulted with an attorney about your recent legal actions. He advised us that your injunctions may not hold up under Colorado property law, especially given our current residency status and the emergency nature of the repairs needed. We're prepared to move forward with necessary maintenance work with or without your cooperation. This is not a threat, just a statement of legal reality." Legal reality. They'd lawyered up, which meant they were committed to this path regardless of consequences. They weren't backing down. They were escalating. That's when something fundamental shifted in my thinking. I'd been trying to prevent a crime, but they'd already committed one. The fraud wasn't in the future. It was happening now. They'd been living in my house under false pretenses, making unauthorized changes to my property, and now they were threatening to take out loans against my home despite legal orders prohibiting it. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was war. I spent the weekend making calls to resources I'd hoped never to use. The FBI has a specific task force for fraud targeting military personnel. The Inspector General's office takes reports of family member financial abuse seriously. The Colorado Attorney General has a consumer protection division that prosecutes real estate fraud aggressively. Most importantly, I called the one person whose authority superseded everyone else's, my commanding officer. Major Patricia Hawkins listened to my situation with the clinical attention of someone who'd dealt with similar cases before. "Martinez, I'm authorizing immediate emergency leave," she said. "This level of financial attack on a deployed soldier requires direct intervention. You'll fly home Monday morning and handle this situation decisively." "Ma'am, I don't want special treatment." "This isn't special treatment, soldier. This is force protection. When enemy action threatens a service member's ability to focus on mission requirements, we eliminate the threat. Your parents have made themselves a threat to military readiness, and we're going to treat them accordingly." Quote. Sunday night, I packed a single duffel bag with uniforms and civilian clothes. I wasn't going home for a visit or a family reunion. I was returning to Colorado as a federal law enforcement asset, with full legal backing and unlimited resources. My parents thought they were dealing with their scared little girl who'd always given them money when they asked. They had no idea they'd just declared war on the United States military. and they were about to learn the difference. I landed at Denver International Airport at 0600 hours on a gray February morning, wearing my dress uniform and carrying orders that gave me legal authority most civilians never see. The flight from Kuwait had taken 18 hours, but I'd spent every minute of it planning my next moves with the methodical precision the Army had drilled into me. My parents didn't know I was coming. They thought I was still deployed, still isolated, still dependent on their version of events. They had no idea that a deployed soldier with documented evidence of fraud could access resources that moved faster than any civilian legal system. My first stop wasn't my house. It was the federal building downtown, where Special Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division was waiting for me at 0800 sharp. She'd reviewed the case file during my flight and had questions. The recorded conversations establish intent, she said, spreading documents across the conference table. The forged emergency repair claims show methodology. But what we need is evidence of actual financial transactions. Have they moved money yet? They sold the house, I said, handing her the manila envelope I'd received in Afghanistan. Transferred ownership to themselves for $1 while I was deployed. My signature was forged on multiple documents. Agent Park's expression hardened as she reviewed the sale paperwork. This isn't amateur hour fraud, she said. Someone helped them structure this to avoid obvious red flags. The timing, the nominal fee transfer, the way they handled the deed recording, this was planned by someone who understands real estate law. She was right. My parents weren't smart enough to orchestrate something this sophisticated alone. Someone had coached them, provided legal guidance, maybe even handled the paperwork. Someone who knew exactly how to steal a deployed soldier's property while making it look legitimate. We'll need to move fast, Agent Park continued. If they realize you're back, they might try to liquidate assets or transfer funds offshore. How do you want to handle the initial contact? I don't want to handle it, I said. I want you to handle it, with backup. At 1030 hours, a 3-car convoy of federal agents arrived at my house. I watched from the surveillance van as they knocked on the door that used to be mine. Through the audio equipment, I heard my mother's confused voice. Is Sophia okay? Is something wrong? Ma'am, we're here to execute a search warrant related to real estate fraud involving a deployed service member. Agent Park's voice came through clearly. We need you and your husband to step outside while we conduct our investigation. The silence that followed was longer than any pause in our family's history. What the agents found inside my house was worse than I'd imagined. My parents hadn't just been living there, they'd been running a full-scale operation. In what used to be my home office, they'd set up a command center with files containing my personal information, copies of my military records, and detailed research on property law and power of attorney regulations. But the most damning evidence was in a folder labeled, quote, Martinez Construction Estimates. The paperwork inside showed the basement flooding story was completely fabricated. There were multiple versions of the same estimates, with different damage assessments and cost projections, like they'd been testing different scenarios to see which would justify the largest loan amount. More troubling were the financial documents Agent Park found in my father's desk. Bank statements showing they'd already received a $15,000 advance from Martinez Construction for emergency repair work. Work orders for renovations that had never been performed. Insurance claims filed under my policy for damage that didn't exist. They'd been stealing from me systematically for months, using my house as collateral for loans and my insurance for fraudulent claims. The basement flooding was just their latest and most ambitious scam. While the FBI processed the crime scene, I drove to Martinez Construction with a different kind of federal escort. Tony Martinez, my parents' cousin, was not happy to see me walking into his office flanked by Treasury Department investigators. Sophia, hey, what are you doing back? He asked, his smile faltering when he saw the badges. Your parents said you wouldn't be home for months. Mr. Martinez, said Agent Sandra Walsh from Treasury, we're investigating fraudulent construction contracts and insurance claims involving this property. We need to discuss the $15,000 you advanced to David and Carmen Martinez for work that was never performed. Tony's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. That was legitimate advance payment for foundation work. Foundation work on a house that our structural engineer examined this morning and found to be in perfect condition, Agent Walsh replied. Foundation work that your own internal emails show was never scheduled, never planned, and never intended to be performed. The beautiful thing about federal investigations is that they don't operate like local police. They don't ask suspects to voluntarily cooperate or hope people tell the truth. They access phone records, email servers, bank transactions, and financial histories with warrants that get approved in hours instead of weeks. By 1,400 hours, Tony Martinez was in federal custody, his business accounts were frozen, and investigators had uncovered a broader pattern of construction fraud targeting military families. My parents hadn't just stumbled into crime. They'd been recruited into an established operation that specifically targeted deployed service members. That afternoon, I finally went home. My house looked exactly the same from the outside, but walking through the rooms felt like touring a museum of my former life. They'd changed more than I'd realized. Different furniture, new paint colors, personal photos replaced with generic artwork. They'd been erasing me from my own home, room by room. In my bedroom, I found the most personal violation. My military awards and commendations, which I'd kept in a display case, had been moved to a closet and replaced with my father's factory recognition plaques. My deployment photos, my unit memorabilia, my Purple Heart certificate, all of it hidden away like embarrassing reminders of someone who no longer mattered. But they'd made one critical error. In their eagerness to make the house feel like theirs, they'd kept meticulous records of every change, every purchase, every modification. My mother, the same woman who could never balance a checkbook, had maintained detailed files showing exactly how they'd spent money from fraudulent loans to redecorate my property. That evening, Agent Park called with an update that surprised even her. "Your parents weren't just committing fraud," she said. "They were being investigated by the IRS for tax evasion, by the state for welfare fraud, and by HUD for housing assistance violations." This real estate theft wasn't their first crime. It was their exit strategy. They'd been planning to use my house as their retirement plan, live there illegally while I was deployed, refinance it to extract cash, then claim ownership through adverse possession laws by the time I returned. If it worked, they'd have a free house and $100,000 in equity. If it failed, they'd declare bankruptcy and disappear, leaving me to deal with the fraudulent loans and legal mess. It was a plan that might have worked against a civilian, but they'd made one fatal miscalculation. They'd committed federal crimes against a United States soldier, and the U.S. government takes that personally. The arrests happened at 0600 the next morning. I wasn't there to watch, but Agent Park sent me the details later. My father tried to run when he saw the federal marshals approaching. My mother immediately started crying and claiming they'd been forced into it by financial desperation. Neither strategy worked against agents who'd seen every sob story and every excuse in the book. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate theft. Because the crimes targeted a deployed service member, federal sentencing guidelines added enhanced penalties that could mean decades in prison instead of years. But the real devastation wasn't the criminal charges. It was the civil asset forfeiture. Every dollar they'd stolen, every fraudulent loan, every insurance payment had to be repaid with interest and penalties. The government seized their cars, their bank accounts, their personal property, even the clothes they'd bought with stolen money. Within 48 hours, my parents went from living in my house and planning their golden years to sitting in federal detention awaiting trial for crimes that would destroy their lives permanently. That night, I stood in my empty house. Truly empty now, since most of the furniture had been purchased with fraudulent loans and seized as evidence, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete silence. No demands for money, no manufactured emergencies, no guilt trips about family loyalty. Just peace. Outside, neighbors were whispering about the federal raid, the arrests, the shocking revelation that the nice couple who'd been living there for months weren't actually the homeowners. Inside, I was finally alone in the space I'd built with my own hands and my own money. They'd tried to steal my future. Instead, they'd destroyed their own. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching my parents receive their sentences. My father got 8 years for conspiracy and fraud. My mother got 6 years for identity theft and insurance fraud. They'd each aged a decade since their arrest, their faces hollow with the reality that their golden years would be spent in federal prison. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I declined. There was nothing left to say. They'd made their choices, committed their crimes, and now they were facing the consequences. No words from me could change what they'd done or add meaning to their punishment. As I walked out of the courthouse, I realized I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not even sadness. Just emptiness, where a family used to be. They'd taught me that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, that desperation can turn love into exploitation, and that sometimes the people who claim to care about you the most are the ones most willing to destroy you for their own benefit. My emergency leave had stretched into a permanent change of station. The Army, recognizing the unique circumstances and the ongoing legal proceedings, had transferred me to Fort Carson, 30 minutes from my house. I could finish my deployment cycle stateside while handling the legal aftermath of my parents' crimes. The house felt different now, not just because it was empty of their belongings, but because it was truly mine for the first time. They'd never really left me alone in it before. Even during my first deployment, I'd known they were there, making changes, imposing their presence on my space. Now, walking through rooms that echoed with my footsteps alone, I finally understood what ownership actually meant. I spent my first month back, just living in silence. No manufactured emergencies. No guilt trips about family obligations. No requests for money disguised as temporary loans. Just the quiet rhythm of my own life, my own choices, my own priorities. The renovation process became therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Stripping away the changes they'd made wasn't just about restoring my house. It was about reclaiming my identity. Every wall I repainted, every piece of furniture I chose, every decision I made without consulting anyone else, felt like a small victory over the version of myself that had always bent to their demands. I kept one room exactly as they'd left it, the home office where they'd planned their crimes. Not as a shrine or a reminder, but as evidence of something important, how much planning it takes to systematically betray someone who trusts you. The files, the research, the multiple versions of their lies. All of it showed that this wasn't desperation or momentary weakness. It was calculated exploitation that had taken months to orchestrate. The financial recovery was easier than expected. Federal law enforcement had gotten excellent at asset recovery in fraud cases, and they'd traced every dollar my parents had stolen. Insurance companies paid claims for the fraudulent policies they'd taken out. The government seized and sold Tony Rodriguez's business assets to compensate victims. Within 4 months, I'd recovered not just what was stolen, but additional damages and penalties that left me financially better off than before. But the real recovery was psychological. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's financial mistakes. I wasn't getting calls about emergencies that weren't really emergencies. I wasn't torn between my own goals and other people's needs. I was just free. My unit noticed the change immediately. Sergeant Thompson, who'd watched me struggle with family drama throughout my deployment, pulled me aside after a training exercise. "Martinez, you're different," she said. "More focused, less distracted. Whatever you did with that family situation, it worked." She was right. The hypervigilance that had developed from constantly monitoring my parents' potential crimes had redirected itself into military excellence. I'd been promoted twice in 6 months, selected for advanced training programs, and recommended for officer candidate school. Removing the toxic stress of family manipulation had unleashed potential I didn't know I had. The legal aftermath continued for over a year. Tony Rodriguez's construction company had been defrauding military families for nearly a decade, using local connections and family relationships to identify targets and exploit their deployments. My parents had been recruited because of my military service, my property ownership, and my deployment schedule. I wasn't their first victim. I was just the first one who fought back effectively. The broader investigation led to dozens of arrests and exposed a network of fraud that had stolen millions from military families. My case became a template for how deployed service members could protect themselves and respond to family financial abuse. The FBI started including deployment fraud awareness in their military outreach programs, using lessons learned from my parents' sophisticated but ultimately failed scheme. From my parents' sophisticated but ultimately failed scheme. I testified before a congressional subcommittee about military family financial abuse, helping to strengthen laws protecting deployed service members from exploitation by their own relatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' betrayal had made me an advocate for other military families facing similar situations. 2 years after their sentencing, I received a letter from my mother in federal prison. It was 5 pages of explanations, justifications, and requests for forgiveness. She was sorry, she wrote. They'd been desperate. They'd convinced themselves they were entitled to help because they'd raised me. They'd never meant for things to go so far. But what stood out wasn't her apologies. It was her assumption that I would visit her, send money for the commissary, help with legal appeals. Even from prison, facing the consequences of stealing from me, she still thought I owed her something. She still believed that family obligation should override the reality of her crimes. I never responded to the letter. Instead, I did something that would have been impossible before their betrayal. I built relationships based on mutual respect instead of familial obligation. I dated without worrying about whether women would become financial burdens. I made friends without calculating what they might ask me for. I invested in my own future without setting aside emergency funds for other people's crises. The house became a home in ways it never had been before. I hosted barbecues for my unit, holiday parties for friends, study groups for the college classes I was taking with my GI Bill benefits. The rooms that had once echoed with arguments about money and obligation now filled with laughter, conversation, and genuine connection. On the 3rd anniversary of their arrest, I did something I'd never done before. I threw myself a party. Not for my birthday or a promotion, just because I wanted to celebrate being free. 20 people showed up. Soldiers, civilians, neighbors, friends I'd made since learning what healthy relationships actually looked like. As I watched people enjoying themselves in the house my parents had tried to steal, eating food I'd bought with money I'd earned, talking and laughing without anyone asking me for financial favors or manufacturing emergencies, I realized something profound. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or manipulation or conditional love based on usefulness. Just people who chose to be there, who contributed to each other's lives, who respected boundaries and celebrated successes. My parents had taught me that family meant sacrifice, that love required giving up your dreams for other people's needs. But they'd been wrong. Real family, chosen family, healthy family, meant mutual support, shared joy, and respect for each other's independence. They'd tried to steal my house, but they'd accidentally given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I deserved better than their version of love. That I could build something real and lasting without their drama, their demands, their constant chaos. The last time I drove past the federal prison where they were serving their sentences, I didn't slow down or look toward the building. I just kept driving, radio playing, windows down, heading home to a house that was truly mine and a life they couldn't touch anymore. They'd taught me to serve others at my own expense. Instead, I'd learned to serve my country, my community, and myself with honor. They'd raised a son who would sacrifice everything for family loyalty. But they'd created a man who understood the difference between love and exploitation, between family and toxic obligation. And in the end, that understanding was worth more than anything they could have stolen. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.